Welcome. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get going here. My name is Melanie Zement, and I am the Communications and Program Associate here at the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. If you're new to the center, welcome. If you're a regular, we're super happy to have you back. Today's Fellows in the Field workshop is an opportunity for folks in the field such as yourselves to hear directly from our fellows about their projects and their practical application in day-to-day life on campus. As many of you are already aware, the center has a fellowship program that brings together faculty, administrators, and practitioners to conduct a year-long research project. The research of our latest class of fellows was released in August. If you haven't had the chance to peruse their wonderful work, I encourage you to do so at the link that's going to be dropped into the chat. We have just one more Fellows in the Field workshop after this one coming up on November 4th, so I encourage you to register. We will also drop a link to that in the chat. As we go through today's presentation, we encourage you to share your questions using the Q&A function. We will do our best to address as many of them as possible. If you want to enable closed captioning, you can do so by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says Turn on Caption. Additionally, as a heads up, we will ask for your participation in the form of some reflection a bit later on in the program. More to come on that later. Now on to the main event. In today's highly partisan environment, it can be easy to feel dialogue across difference is a hopeless cause, but as this fellowship project demonstrates, personal relationships can be a powerful antidote. Our esteemed guests, Doctors Tara and Alyssa, have spent the past year gathering student stories about these friendships and developing actionable strategies and educational interventions to support democratic learning and reduce campus polarization. Dr. Tara Hudson is Associate Professor in Higher Education Administration at Kent State University. Dr. Hudson has worked in higher education for the past 12 years, including 5 years as an academic advisor. Her theoretical, conceptual, and practitioner-based expertise regarding college students' diverse friendships and pro-social development guides the design and theoretical framing of this study. Dr. Alyssa Rockenbach is Alumni Distinguished Graduate Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Leadership, Policy, and Human Development at North Carolina State University, as co-principal investigator of the Interfaith Diversity Experiences and Attitudes Longitudinal Survey, which tracked thousands of college students attending 122 U.S. colleges and universities over 4 years. Dr. Rockenbach has cultivated in-depth expertise regarding how educational experiences, including friendships, affect college students' capacity to engage and cooperate across social differences. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us, and I will turn things over to them to share about their work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that wonderful introduction. And I will pull up our slides. All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us today and having this conversation about college students' friendships across political differences. We're really glad you're here and we're looking forward to the time together. I also want to say a big thank you to our wonderful colleagues at the center for hosting this webinar and also for their amazing support of our project over the last year. So I want to share a little bit of context about what led Tara and I to this work and the ways that we've been thinking about it over the last many years. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in this work is that there's really a core message in higher education research, and that talks about the power of the peer group. And we know that peer groups create campus cultures. They help to establish social norms on campus, and they make a really big impression on students' learning and development. And so something that Tara and I talk about a lot is, so if we know that the peer group has such a big effect, wouldn't students' closest friends maybe have an even more profound impact? And we know that friendships or close relationships tend to get less attention by researchers and educators in higher education. So we've spent some time really thinking about friendships and why they matter. So a couple of key ideas. We know that friendships matter, first of all, because social support networks are a really critical foundation for students to adjust to college and flourish in college. students really need friends for that journey. And we also know that friendships support well-being throughout life, that people who have social support and community tend to fare better in their well-being. And it also can sometimes be hard to make friends as adults, and college can be a really key time for making some of those lifelong friends. The other point I want to make here, and this really comes out of some of the work that Tara and I have done around friendships across social differences. So Tara's done some work on interracial friendship, and together we've done some work on interfaith or interworldview friendship. And through that work, we've really come to see the power of those friendships. We see them providing a space for students to become more empathic, more connected, and more accepting of people who don't share their same social identities. And research has shown that friendships that cross these boundaries of social identity difference play a really important role in students becoming more pro-social, helping to support gains in democratic outcomes, and overall reducing prejudice and improving positive attitudes. So I wanted to share a couple of data points that got us excited about studying friendships across political differences or interpartisan friendships. And this comes out of some work on a study that was a national longitudinal study of how students engage religious differences. That's called ideals. And so a lot of the questions were oriented around religion, but we also asked students about politics as well, knowing that these tend to be pretty intertwined in people's lives. And what we found was that politics was pretty salient in college student friendships. I'm showing on this slide a statistic that says that 65% of students, or close to two-thirds, had said they had a disagreement with their friends about politics, and they ended up staying friends nonetheless. And so they're engaging in these conversations. And we found that fewer students were having those types of disagreements around religion and staying friends. Only 38% said that they did that. So this shows us that politics are really important in these friendships, and students are able to have tenacity in the midst of those disagreements. So we got really curious about what these interpartisan friendships are like and the significance of them in students' lives. And so that brings us to the questions of our current study that we've been working on over the last year. And a lot of the work around friendship, especially interpartisan friendship, has been largely quantitative, focused on survey data. And so our project was really about the stories of college students' interpartisan friendships, understanding them in greater depth and having students tell us and walk us through what those experiences were like for them. So we wanted to know, how did those friendships develop? How are those friendships sustained and deepened across time? What were the challenges and conflicts that students were experiencing in those friendships? And how did they experience change potentially as a result of those friends in their lives? And we wanted to know in what ways those relationships were shaped by their campus or by mentors or faculty and staff that they engaged with. And then finally, these are students who have figured something out. They have a lot of wisdom about how to reach across political divides. And so we wanted to see their recommendations for how to foster interpartisan friendships on campus more broadly. So we asked them to share their insight about that. So I'll move on to sharing just a little bit about our research design. And we started out with a survey, and our group of fellows and the center were really wonderful about helping us kind of get the word out about this study. So we surveyed students around the US, and it was a very brief survey. So really it just asked them, did you have this type of friendship? And what did it mean to you? Tell us a little bit about it. And we use that survey data to help us invite and identify participants who had some really rich stories to share. So we had 15 participants who opted to participate in interviews with us. And as a first step of their participation, we invited them to create a collage, an artistic kind of way to show us about what their friendship meant to them. And we used that collage to help guide the conversation that we had. And then from there, once we had conducted the interviews, we actually wrote up a narrative for each participant so we could kind of look at each story in its own right. And then from there, we looked at cross-cutting themes that connected all 15 stories. All right, so let's move on to the findings. So we want to share, what were the key dimensions of these interpartisan friendships? What did students share with us? And the first thing is that these friendships began in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of different pathways to students cultivating these types of friendships. So there were a few participants who had met their friends off campus, sometimes before college. So they were in the minority, but there were a few of those stories that we heard. So Moses talked about meeting his friend Sally before college, and Sally was actually one of his close childhood friends, and they had maintained their friendship into their college years. Grace was a gamer and was very engaged in a local game store, and that's where she met her friend. So it was in more of an off-campus context. For all the other participants, they tended to meet their friends in some more typical ways in college, whether that was in class, whether that was in residence life, or through some sort of student organization that they participated in. And those bonds tended to be stronger if they were engaging one another in multiple contexts. So maybe they had a class together, maybe they lived near each other, maybe they participated in a student organization together, and that helped to facilitate their bond. And these friendships were taking shape in a very charged political environment. So we were conducting our interviews in fall 2024, right around the time of the presidential election. And students were really feeling that at the time. Participants described a wide range of political activity and activism on their campuses. They talked about movements for justice, controversial speakers coming to campus, generally a climate of division and sometimes fear that they were feeling. And I will say too, there were some campuses where the students talked about they were encouraged to dialogue around the issues of the day. So they had some opportunities to do that. But as Margot says here, it did feel very cold around campus post-election. It was a very heavy feeling. And this backdrop factored into a lot of the friends' experiences and their conversations. Sometimes it brought about conflict or tension between them, but sometimes there was an opportunity for finding common ground. So some of the women in our study talked about overturning of Roe v. Wade and how that had connected friends across the political spectrum and helped them to find some common ground. At the same time, there was minimal intentionality. So there was little evidence that staff, faculty, and administrators or any kind of campus programming was really helping the friends in very explicit or direct ways. And so they talked about that. So Max's quote here, I think, really reflects that. And he said, "Yeah, I don't think they care about that." In other words, interpartisan friendship. So while there wasn't a lot of proactive support for interpartisan friendship, when the friends talked about how their campus shaped their friendship, it was usually about the physical spaces that brought them together. Those physical spaces turned out to be very meaningful for them, whether that was meeting up in a science lab, having a favorite coffee shop that they would return to, meeting up to study in the library or living close by in campus housing. So Jessica talked about the convenience of being able to spontaneously see her friend in the library or other buildings on campus. And it was interesting to see how friendships progressed based on where they were engaging in those physical spaces. So one participant said, when we were more acquaintances, we would meet at the library to study. But as we became closer and as our friendship deepened, we started doing more fun activities together, like going to the museum on campus. So you can actually see the shift in the depth of the friendship based on the type of physical space that they were engaging in. And there were a lot of challenges in these friendships, as you might imagine. So there were power dynamics, there were painful tensions. And to the point about power dynamics, we noticed that some of the friendships had uneven sharing, with one of the friends feeling more freedom to express their political opinions, and the other friend simply listening or feeling fearful about what could come about if they expressed their views. And this dynamic tended to play out among friends where there was a power difference of some kind, with the friend who kept quieter, maybe feeling less educated on the issues or feeling vulnerable because of their marginalized identity. So we did hear about some of those power dynamics as really being significant and shaping kind of the authenticity that the friends were feeling in that relationship. And around stress and pain and tension, those were realities that the friends were contending with. Sometimes they had very heated conversations with one another, or even just felt the tension in the air that brought about pain. And those political differences could really translate into something deeply personal. So it wasn't just a debate about the issues, it could affect who they were, their own identities, and the communities that they were a part of as well. So, how did friends navigate these differences and these challenges? And it turns out that they used a number of different strategies. And it was really amazing to see that no two friendships were alike. They all had their differences, but a lot of times there were multiple strategies that were going on in each friendship. So I'll describe some of those for y'all. One was letting go and letting differences just be. So they often talked about, if the conversation is getting too heated, we know that it's time to put a cork in it or put a pin in it and move on, and maybe we'll come back to it later. So the notion of letting go in that moment was very important to them. There was also something that we called relational softening, or responding softly and gently rather than harshly to differences in the friendship. So AJ talked about approaching his friend with curiosity when he didn't understand something rather than with judgment. And then civil discourse was important. So Ellery talked about having learned some civil discourse skills in her honors program, and she used that in her friendship with Piper when they were having conversations. And there was also this notion of coming to the friendship with a mindset for valuing difference and recognizing, as Jessica says here, that it's valuable to have someone who can challenge your views and even sometimes change how you feel about them. And then the fifth strategy that I want to lift up here is the notion of humanizing one another. So there were in these friendships, students were able to um, reduce their stereotypes, to release these kind of hollow caricatures that they had of political others, and recognize that their friend was a full human being who had a lot of different qualities. And so Moses said, her political views do not define her as a human being. He's recognizing all of the different dimensions that make her who she is. And these friendships were sustained by shared interests, peer networks, and positive relational qualities. So they found things in common. And John, for instance, talked about having a close friendship that was based in something else other than politics. So intramural soccer helped to bond him with his friend. And there were these wonderful relational qualities. So a lot of the friendships talked about love and admiration for one another. So Georgiana said, she loved me, she showed me love, and that made me love her back. And then finally, impact. We saw that these friendships really helped students to gain a greater sense of openness, new ways of thinking, and other personal and relational strengths. So, Catherine, for instance, told a story about going to a protest with her friend Marisol and feeling unsettled, feeling uncomfortable in that environment, but it helped really open her eyes, helped her to change her view, even to think about the ways that she needed to change and recognizing that she needed to listen and to learn more about the issues at hand. And then finally, we heard wonderful stories about all of the personal and relational strengths that students developed in these friendship contexts. So, friends said things like, she helps me out of my comfort zone. She's helped me when I've had relationship problems. My friend has helped me to be more open, be more patient, and has taught me how to give grace. Friends talked about that their friend helped them to break out of their shell or helped change their sense of humor. So there were a lot of examples of the really the shaping influence of these friendships in students' lives. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tara, who will share more about our toolkit and some of our recommendations for educators.
Thank you, Alyssa. And so, while understanding student stories of their experiences in interpartisan friendships was important, we also wanted to use those stories, right? So, come up with some ways that colleges and universities can better support interpartisan friendships on their campuses because they're so crucial as we talked about at the beginning, right, for pro-social learning and development, but also in the current political moment. So our research led us to develop two toolkits, so one for campus educators and one for college students themselves. And today we're going to focus on our campus educator toolkit, but both of our toolkits are available on the UC Center's website for free downloads. So we encourage you to download them and share with your colleagues and with the students you work with as well. So the strategies and resources we recommend within the toolkits integrate wisdom from three different sources. So first of all, the lived experiences and recommendations of the students we spoke with. So they had a lot of really valuable things to say. And second, we also gathered recommendations from practitioners working in higher education spaces. And then finally, the research literature on college students' interpartisan friendships, as well as friendships across other social boundaries like race, ethnicity, and religious, secular, and spiritual identity, like Alyssa mentioned at the beginning. So before we dive into the toolkit, we want to address an argument that we've occasionally heard, which is that college students' friendships are beyond the bounds of what campus educators should concern themselves with, or that what we're proposing, that is creating campus conditions and fostering student learning to support interpartisan friendships, is social engineering, right? And not desirable, not something that we should be doing as educators. So to counter this argument, we offer 2 points. So first of all, interpartisan friendship, as we've talked about, is an incredibly powerful tool for reducing partisan animosity and divisiveness, not just among college students, but in society at large, and also for fostering the civic and democratic learning that colleges purportedly value and aim to develop in their students. And second, we would argue that all of education is social engineering, right? And colleges and universities have always engaged in this by choosing whom to admit or reject as students, allocating financial aid on the basis of merit versus need, determining general education outcomes, deciding what co-curricular programs and student services to invest in, right? So the list of examples pretty much covers everything that institutions do in the realm of academic and student affairs. And as John Dewey noted more than a century ago, effective education necessitates designing environments conducive to inculcating students with desired attributes and dispositions. So the bottom line, as we see it, is that it's our job as campus educators to educate our students so they can positively participate in and contribute to our society after they graduate. And creating a campus environment in which interpartisan friendships can thrive is one powerful way to achieve this goal, especially right now in our current political environment. All right. So we don't have time to go through the full toolkit in detail here today, but we do want to highlight some of the key actions educators can take to support interpartisan friendships on their campuses. So let's start with the first action strategy from our toolkit that we want to highlight. So one of the challenges identified by campus educators within our professional networks was the need for resources and language to communicate the value of and the educational imperative for supporting interpartisan friendships among college students to colleagues on their campus, to funders, and to other stakeholders. So much of the research we've done in this area provides empirical support for why friendships across partisan and also other social boundaries matter. And we especially encourage you to read about the findings from this research project to help you understand that and build the argument. And our toolkit also directs you to other helpful resources, including organizations who work to foster bridge building across political differences. So we encourage you to review these resources to craft an argument specific to the needs of your campus and the student populations that you serve. Educating yourself on the empirical literature and other data that documents why interpartisan friendship matters is also an important step to becoming an advocate on your campus and being able to more effectively support the students you work with in their efforts to navigate political differences with peers. And our toolkit also provides a short elevator speech that you can use or adapt to concisely frame this argument as a starting point. So then, in order to effectively develop students' knowledge, skills, and abilities for constructively and respectfully engaging in political conversations, campus educators need to continually develop their own facility in this area. And doing this requires you to model how to have these conversations so that your students can see these skills in action. And then this in turn communicates an expectation for how campus community members are expected to behave when it comes to engaging across political and other differences. So, our toolkit suggests programming, learning communities, and other resources to help you develop your own capacity for engaging in conversations across political differences. And I'll add too that many of these are resources we suggest making available to your students for their own learning and development. Now, participants in our study commented about not seeing much, if any, support for interpartisan friendship or even for just reaching across political divides to peers among the faculty, staff, and administrators on their campuses. And Alyssa covered some of that in the findings. Um, and then further in conversations we've had discussing our study with campus educators, many of them have said the same thing, noting that they don't often see bridge building or friendship among colleagues at their institutions. So, as a campus educator who cares about interpartisan friendships, it's important for you to demonstrate a few things to your students. So, first of all, that you value and intentionally build interpartisan relationships, both personal and professional, of your own, right? Second, that you yourself participate in opportunities to connect with others across political differences. And then third, that you reflect upon the ways political differences or partisanship shows up in your own relationships. So students are looking to us as educators to model the way. And by enacting, as opposed to just espousing, interpartisan friendship as a value, you help to create a campus climate conducive to crossing partisan boundaries for friendship and also to establish interpartisan friendship as a norm at your institution. One broad area of programming that participants in our study reported needing, but not often receiving, to support their interpartisan friendships was mediated discussions so that they can learn more about current political issues and policies from varied perspectives without the fear of getting into conflict with those on the other side. And so the goal of these discussions shouldn't be to change anyone's political beliefs, but rather to develop the skills necessary for constructively and respectfully engaging in conversations with peers across differences in political beliefs and values. And participants also discuss the importance of developing the knowledge of students like themselves about current events and issues so that they can engage in conversations about political topics in an informed and open minded way with peers who hold differing perspectives. So, our toolkit offers some suggestions for existing programs that can be brought to your campus so that you don't have to recreate the wheel, right? There's already a lot of good groups and initiatives doing this work. So, college students are hungry for institutional support that helps them and their fellow students see that conflict and hatred are not inevitable when interacting with a peer who holds different political beliefs. And they want and really crave programming that models how to navigate political differences within interpersonal relationships like friendship. So, as with the previous strategy that I just mentioned, programs that model how to build bridges across political differences within friendships should be incorporated into the curriculum and the co-curriculum to have the widest reach and minimize demands on students' time, right? So this should not be something extra that students have to add to their already packed schedules. And then in addition, by embedding these programs into the curriculum and the co-curriculum, it communicates two important ideas to students and to other campus stakeholders. So first of all, that the ability to navigate political differences within interpersonal relationships is a critical civic outcome necessary for participation in a democratic society that all graduates of your college or university are expected to attain. And second, that friendships crossing political and other boundaries have educational value. So while helping students develop their facility and comfort with political conversations and navigating these differences within their friendships is important, it's also important to help students recognize the similarities and common ground they have with politically different peers so that they can break out of established patterns of homogeneity, right? Only talking to peers that share their beliefs or that, maybe they assume would be allies politically. So when college students discover shared interests in activities like sports or video games, or in academics, right? Like they might have the same major, or they might have shared interest in things like music or movies, or sometimes along other dimensions, like a shared faith background or coming from the same region of the country. These things provide a foundation on which students can build and sustain a friendship that transcends their differences. And equally important is having spaces on campus that foster informal peer interaction and social engagement. So things like studying together, dining together, just hanging out and listening to music or playing video games, right? Because through these activities, college students can build and deepen friendships by pursuing these shared interests. And also, it gives them the opportunity to have conversations to authentically explore what they have in common as well as come to a deeper understanding of their differences. And so, an important contribution that you can make as a campus educator is to challenge the assumption that many college students hold, and honestly, probably a lot of us may hold too, that we couldn't possibly share anything with a peer who holds a different partisan identity. And instead, you can help them find that common ground and see each other as multifaceted individuals rather than just narrowly composed of their political beliefs. So, we therefore recommend designing events to allow students to find this common ground rather than in a way that reinforces partisan divisions. And then the final strategy we want to share is to help students recognize that while interpartisan friendships are valuable and meaningful, they should never lead to harm. And a few of the participants in our study did talk about, as Alyssa mentioned in covering the findings, painful experiences they had within their friendships. So, realistically, conflict is likely, if not inevitable, in interpartisan friendships. But if it's handled well, conflict doesn't have to damage a friendship. And in fact, learning how to handle conflict respectfully can actually strengthen a relationship, as the experiences of many participants in our study demonstrated. And I'll mention the statistic Alyssa shared at the beginning of our presentation from some of our prior research, right? That 65% of college students in that prior survey shared that they had had a political disagreement with a friend and yet remained friends. But we also want to acknowledge that several participants in our study discussed friendships that cause pain, right? Where they felt disrespected, belittled, unheard, or weren't able to express their authentic selves. And we recognize that in the current US political climate, crossing partisan boundaries can carry significant risk, effect, especially for students who hold minoritized sociocultural identities. So it's important that as a campus educator, you can't expect students, especially those from minoritized groups, to engage in peer interactions that carry the risk of harm or trauma. And we want to be clear that we are not suggesting that students who have historically been and continue to be excluded from higher education and whose rights and safety are currently being eroded at the state and national levels should jeopardize their mental or physical well-being or human dignity for the sake of interpartisan friendship. So, programming and mentoring to support interpartisan friendship development needs to include attention to the risks that might arise, and especially for students from minoritized identities that are vulnerable to these harmful interactions. So, as an educator, encourage students to take agency and clearly define their expectations as they consider friendships with those who don't share their views. So, we encourage you all to check out the additional strategies within our toolkit for campus educators because there's plenty more there and in a lot more detail. And also to share this toolkit with your colleagues. And as I mentioned before, we also encourage you to share the student toolkit with the students you work with because we found that students are hungry for support and reaching across political differences despite or maybe because of the current polarization and divisiveness that characterize the broader social context around us all right now. So now we're going to turn to a little bit of reflection for you all to engage in. So those of you who were expecting to just be able to passively listen, here's the moment where you have an opportunity to actually think about, what can I as an educator do with this information? So we're going to give you all some time to reflect individually on this question. So what are 1 to 2 actions that you can take in your current role, whatever that is, and I'm sure everybody here is coming from a variety of different roles, to support college students in engaging with peers across political differences? And so take a moment to reflect. We've got some lovely music we're going to attempt to play for you in the background. And if you feel comfortable posting your action step or action steps in the chat, we would love to have the opportunity to see some of those. So we'll pause here to give you time to reflect. So now that you've had a few moments to reflect on the actions you can take, I'd encourage you, again, if you feel comfortable, to post what you came up with over in the chat. And I'm seeing some really great ideas over there. So I notice a couple of folks have mentioned engaging with organizations that promote this political bridge building, right? And that teach the skills needed to have conversations across difference. So that's great. Um, I love the comment from Jose about leading by example, right? So this was one of the things that we mentioned in the toolkit. Students have to see people successfully doing what we are asking of them. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll say for myself, this work has prompted me to spend a lot of time reflecting on my own interpersonal relationships, right? Because it is something I value, but I don't want to just espouse that value. I want to live it in my own life and model it as well. And there's absolutely, more I can do in that realm myself. Yeah. Few more comments. Let's see. So, yeah, someone else mentioned consistently role modeling, multi-perspective thinking, and bridge building, right? And the willingness to take risks. Yes, I love that idea, right? If students see us as educators not taking risks to reach across our differences, then they certainly are not going to feel safe or empowered to do that themselves. Yeah. Um, yeah, sharing emotional regulation tools to help protect their mental and emotional well-being when having difficult conversations. Absolutely. Yeah, adopting a mindset of curiosity and not judgment. Um, yeah, excellent. And yeah, hopefully this toolkit is useful to those of you doing this work or even thinking about how to get started with this work. Or as the last comment over here mentions, finding a way to share this work with others and maybe even doing a little bit of research on your own campuses about interpartisan friendships. Is there anything anyone else wanted to add in terms of the action strategies you developed? All right. Well, at this point, I think we'll go to question and answer time.
Awesome, I'm back. So feel free to add your questions into the Q&A, or we've also dropped a link to a Google form that Alyssa and Tara are going to be peeking at later so they can write you back some answers if you'd like a bit more interaction. But I am going to take dealer's choice to ask a question, which is I wondered, we didn't mention, we talked about this being within the bounds of curriculum, but we haven't talked specifically about the role of faculty in all of this work and in encouraging friendships. So I just wondered if you could both spend a moment talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can start, and then Alyssa, if you want to chime in. So one thing that we heard from our participants, and we actually asked this specifically of them, right? So have you received any, support, whether explicit or sort of implicit support from, you know, faculty, staff, administrators on your campuses? And for the most part, participants said no. Like this is not something that we talk about in classes. This is not something, we've heard from staff members that we've worked with. And I know the question was specifically about faculty members, but, and there were a few participants who even said the opposite, where, they felt that faculty members in their classes were not. Not just not saying anything about the value of reaching across partisan differences, but sort of implicitly or explicitly actively discouraging it. And so that's a problem. Um, and and so I'm encouraged that some of the action strategies you all came up with, talked about ways that you can, model risk taking, right, and the value of these relationships and so forth. But I think faculty members in particular, I'll speak for myself, right? Oftentimes, maybe don't do the best job of sort of mentoring and modeling things like this for students. And maybe it's because we feel like it's out of the bounds of what we're supposed to be doing as faculty members. But again, given the educational importance of these relationships, it absolutely needs to be modeled and talked about in classroom spaces. Alyssa, would you add anything?
Yeah, I want to echo what you said, Tara, and also lift up what Haley has said in the chat about teaching faculty how to make space for these friendships to blossom in the classroom. And I think that can really be meaningful, right? That if we create dialogue within our classroom settings where students are really having a chance to maybe talk to each other one-on-one or in small groups, and to really cultivate a space where the dialogue is, where they can foster those kinds of relationships. I think that matters a lot. I also think a lot about how important it is to kind of prompt students early on. So like even in the first year experience, or right at the beginning of their first weeks on campus, to encourage them to really think about the friendships that they're fostering, and to maybe consider, reaching beyond what is really convenient, right? A lot of folks are making friends with one another, in the residence halls, for instance. But what if they take some steps to really think about, who am I making friends with, and what are some bridges that I might be able to build in those friendships? So I think prompting early on can really be beneficial, and then continuing to encourage that, of course, after the first year.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, we have a question in the chat about AI, and it makes me think about technology and social media and how much of a role social media plays in friendships these days. And I wondered if you had any ideas from your research, or if any of your participants talked about the role that social media played in their friendships, or whether they use social media to form these friendships.
That's an interesting question. And I will first preface this by saying that I am still learning about AI myself. So I am by no means well versed in that. But what I will say is, it wasn't something we explicitly asked about, but it did come up on occasion. And more so, I don't think, and Alyssa, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any participants talked about developing their friendships through social media. But what they did talk about were conflicts or disagreements that arose based on things they had seen on social media. So, for example, there was one participant. I can't remember which one it was, who talked about, having a friend that she was no longer friends with that, was posting a lot of really what she thought were kind of offensive things, politically offensive things on social media. And, it did lead to conflict in their relationship and was one of the factors why they're not, friends anymore. And I feel like that came up a few other times too, or another way it did come up was participants talking about how sort of the conflict they saw, political conflict they saw taking place on social media, made them hesitant to reach out to peers, for fear of how the peer, what the peers' beliefs would be and how they would meet, the participants' own beliefs. So I think social media can play a negative role. But I don't know. I'm not completely pessimistic either. I think there are some ways it probably could facilitate interpartisan friendship, again, because of that importance of discovering, shared interests and common ground, right? So social media can also facilitate that as well. But I think most of the examples participants talked about tended to be more negative. Alyssa, would you add to that?
Yeah, I think when we were doing our coding, we did have like a social media code. And I would say I agree with Tara. I think I can't think of a positive example of social media that it was generally contributing to this feeling of like a politically charged environment. And I can even think of an example of how it created like arguments within the friendship. So Moses and Sally, who had been childhood friends, and Sally would send Moses these like kind of clips about things that she had seen on Instagram, and it would lead to, an argument between them. And so, yeah, I didn't, I think we could use social media for good potentially, but we didn't have a lot of good examples in the stories that students shared with us.
Unfortunately, I think that that tends to be the case. We have a couple more questions coming in, so I want to ask them to you both. So, Carlos asks if your research suggests reasons why students found it more difficult to have interreligious discussions as contrasted with interpolitical discussions.
Not Not directly, although I will say that Alyssa, since she was one of the principal investigators on the ideal study, which investigated the religious differences, Alyssa, you might have a little bit more insight there, but we haven't done any research to like directly compare the experiences of students in interpartisan friendships to, those in friendships that cross religious, secular, and spiritual identity differences.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, my sense is that that po politics are just so salient. So, and I think that's why we're seeing more of that conversation versus like students talking about their religious or their non-religious perspectives with each other as much. It's also possible that maybe the religious conversation feels even more taboo than politics. I'm not sure that's kind of a hypothesis. And I will say that in these conversations, that we had with students, religion did come up a lot because a lot of times faith or like a religious perspective or non-religious point of view was sort of driving or very influential in the ways that they constructed their own political orientation. So I mean, we definitely heard thoughts about students' own religiosity or worldview and how it factored into conversations with their friends and how it factored into like their political understanding as well. So they're very intertwined. And that's I think why our study of friendships across religious differences ultimately led us to this place to look at interpartisan friendship.
Mm. Okay, one more question came in. To what extent do faculty students engage in open or dialogic discussions in their classes in the current political climate? This person is a third year doctoral student at a public university, and they haven't observed much dialogue or friendly discussion at all in classroom.
I mean, I'll say that really echoes what our participants were saying. And sort of getting back to the question that was posed a moment ago. At least among our participants, right? They didn't report really having any discussion of transcending political differences in personal relationships in their classes. And that's not a question that our study directly addressed. But again, based on both what our participants had to say as well as my own experiences, right, I feel like these aren't conversations that are taking place in many classes. I will say, though, one example and one recommendation one of our participants had, Georgiana, was highlighting the importance of language classes as places for forming friendships that transcend political boundaries, but also other social boundaries, because her rationale was that students who take language classes, and she was talking about like beyond introductory classes, right? So like more advanced language classes, that students who take those classes tend to take them because they want to learn about other cultures and they're open-minded and they want to engage with people who are different from themselves, right? And that makes sense. If you're pursuing advanced study in a language that is not your own native language, that's probably why you're doing it, right? Is motivated by that sort of curiosity and openness. And so I just want to amplify her recommendation to, really invest in language classes, especially because in recent years, a number of institutions have started cutting back on offering language classes.
Yeah, this is making me think about one of our first studies of interpartisan friendship, where we were looking at, and this was a quantitative study, so it was looking at what factors were predictive of students having these sorts of interpartisan friendships. And we had a couple of interesting variables that were about the classroom context and faculty behaviors. And what we found was that faculty could talk, have like kind of an open dialogue with students about politics, and that actually supported interpartisan friendship development. Where it was bad was where students were feeling coerced to share the faculty member's political perspective on something. That had a very detrimental effect on interpartisan friendship. So the open dialogue is a really great thing. It's when something feels coercive that it can be detrimental for people building those bridges across difference.
So, your answer made me think of a question that was posed pre webinar in the registration form. And someone asked what lessons from these interpartisan friendships might be transferable to cross cultural or international settings. I know we have a lot of international students on our campus and campuses, and wondered if there were any core things that you might think transfer.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to mind, because it's something that I found in my previous research on college students' interracial friendships, is again that importance of finding common ground and shared interests, right? When someone, comes from a different country than you, right? Maybe is not as fluent in your language as you are, it's easy to see that person as someone you couldn't possibly have something in common with. But if you discover, for example, that you both really love soccer, that's going to be a powerful opportunity to find that common ground, right? And engage in shared interests that will allow you to develop a relationship. I think that's true for any kind of friendship across social boundaries. So that's one that would jump to mind for me.
Yeah, and I think too that the humanizing impact of reaching across difference is true whatever type of like social boundary we're talking about in friendship. And that is really, I think for me, like one of the most beautiful parts of this work was being able to see that, to see students build that empathy with one another, and to really again humanize and let go of these stereotypes that they had about people who didn't share their beliefs or perspectives or identities. And so I think there's a lot of good in any type of bridge building relationships.
Well, that is a hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. Thank you for asking your questions. We encourage you to check out the full toolkit and to register for our final Fellows in the Field November 4th. Thank you both for joining us again, and we'll talk to you all next time. Bye.